She stood frozen at the company gate, cameras flashing in her face, microphones shoved toward her trembling lips. A poor employee, a sudden scandal, accused of stealing company money in the name of charity. Her hands shook as tears rolled down her cheeks. Around her, colleagues watched in silence, some curious, some satisfied, none brave enough to speak. High above, behind a glass window, the billionaire CEO looked down at the chaos, his jaw tight. His heart torn between power and truth. Just days ago, no one knew her name. Just days ago, she was invisible. So how did a quiet woman who fed disabled strangers with her last coins become the center of a national disgrace overnight? And when kindness is punished this brutally, will justice still find its way back? Before the story unfolds, tell us where you're watching from in your local time. If stories of kindness, justice, and second chances move you, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us till the very end. In the heart of Abuja, where glass towers rose beside crowded streets and ambition moved faster than traffic, lived a young woman named Abeni Okoye. She was one of thousands who poured into the city every morning chasing survival, not success. Abeni worked as a junior customer service officer at Lawson Group, a powerful corporation known for its rigid structure and unforgiving pace. Her desk sat near the back of the open office, far from the executives' glass rooms, far from attention. Abeni earned just enough to get by. After rent, transport, and food, there was rarely anything left. Her apartment was small, tucked inside an aging building with flickering lights and peeling paint. The walls were thin, the nights often loud, and the mornings always rushed. Yet every day she woke before dawn, ironed her simple clothes with care, and prepared herself for another long day of quiet endurance. At work, Abeni was invisible. She answered customer complaints patiently, apologized for problems she did not cause, and stayed late when others rushed home. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. When meetings became loud with competing voices, she shrank into her chair, scribbling notes no one asked for. Praise never came her way, but criticism sometimes did. Still, she never complained. To her, a job, even an unnoticed one, was a blessing. But Abeni's real life did not begin until the workday ended. Every evening after logging out of her computer and stepping into the warm Abuja air, she followed the same routine. Instead of heading straight home, she walked toward a small roadside market near a busy junction. The market was chaotic and alive, hawkers shouting, generators humming, buses honking impatiently. With the little money she had left in her purse, Abeni bought loaves of bread, packs of rice, sometimes fruit or bottled water if she could afford it. She packed everything carefully into a black nylon bag, tying it tight so nothing would spill. Then she walked toward the edge of the junction where a group of disabled men and women sat every day. Some were blind. Some used crutches. Others dragged weak legs across the ground to reposition themselves. They were part of the city, yet invisible to it, noticed only when traffic slowed or when someone wanted to feel generous for a moment. Abeni knelt beside them without fear or hesitation. She greeted each person softly, calling them brother and sister. She handed out food slowly, making sure no one was skipped. If someone struggled to open a pack, she helped. If someone looked sick, she asked gently if they were all right. She did not rush even when the sky darkened or the road grew louder. She never asked questions, she never took photos, she never preached. To Abeni, this was not charity, it was responsibility. She remembered her mother's words from childhood, spoken in a quiet village far from Abuja. If you eat while another starves beside you, your food will never satisfy you. Those words had stayed with her, shaping her long before the city hardened her hands and feet. The disabled men and women had grown used to her presence. When they saw her red blouse appear through the crowd, some smiled. Others whispered prayers under their breath. They did not know much about her life, and she did not share it. All they knew was that she came even when it rained, even when she looked tired, even when she clearly had little for herself. On days when she had nothing extra, she still came to sit with them for a few minutes. Sometimes all she offered was conversation and a listening ear. And when she finally turned to leave, she walked away lighter than when she arrived. Abeni never thought of herself as kind. She simply believed that pain should not be ignored. What she did not know, what she could not imagine, was that someone else had begun to notice her. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the city slipped into its golden hour, Kola Lawson, the billionaire CEO of Lawson Group, was stuck in traffic. His driver had taken the familiar route home, one lined with shops, street sellers, and desperate faces. Kola sat quietly in the back seat, scrolling through reports on his tablet, his mind heavy with numbers and deadlines. Then the car slowed. At the junction, his eyes lifted first out of impatience, then out of curiosity. He saw the disabled people sitting by the roadside as he had seen countless times before. Normally he looked past them. Normally they blurred into the background of a city he had conquered. But this time something was different. Something. A woman moved through the crowd with calm purpose. She carried a black nylon bag and knelt beside each person, handing out food. There was no hesitation in her movements, no performance. She listened when they spoke. She smiled when they smiled. She stayed. Kola leaned forward slightly, his brows furrowing. The woman looked familiar. As the car rolled closer, recognition hit him like a sudden jolt. He knew that face. He had seen it in the office, quiet, serious, always focused on her screen. It was Abeni Okoye, one of his employees. Kola's chest tightened. She was not wealthy. She was not senior staff. She was not known for anything beyond competence and silence. Yet there she was, giving away food she clearly had to budget for carefully to people who could offer her nothing in return. The car crept past, but Kola could not look away. For the first time in years, something unsettled him deeply. He had signed million-dollar deals, donated publicly to charities, and funded projects with his name proudly displayed. Yet none of those acts struck him the way this simple moment did. Why would someone with so little give so much? As traffic finally cleared and the car moved on, Kola leaned back, his tablet forgotten. His thoughts were no longer on profits or expansion plans. They were on a quiet woman kneeling on a dirty roadside, feeding strangers with her last coins. He did not know it yet, but that moment had already changed him. And somewhere behind him, Abeni finished handing out the last pack of food, wiped her hands on her skirt, and headed home. Unaware that her invisible kindness had just been seen by the most powerful man in her world. That night, long after the traffic had cleared and Abuja's streets settled into their restless calm, Kola Lawson sat alone in the back of his car, staring out of the window without seeing anything at all. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white, but his mind was far away from boardrooms, from contracts, from the empire he had spent decades building. All he could see was her, Abeni Okoye, kneeling by the roadside, handing out food as if time itself had slowed down for her alone. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Kola Lawson was not a cruel man. He paid his taxes. He donated generously when disaster struck. His company sponsored foundations, scholarships, and medical outreaches. His name appeared on banners and plaques across the country. To the world, he was a responsible billionaire, a man who gave back. Yet something about what he had witnessed made all of that feel strangely hollow. Abeni had not known she was being watched. There were no cameras, no applause, no audience waiting to praise her sacrifice. She had given quietly, steadily, without expecting anything in return. And that was what disturbed him most. Kola leaned back, exhaling slowly. "How much does she earn?" he asked suddenly. His driver glanced at him in the mirror, surprised by the question. "Sir, that young woman we passed, the one feeding the disabled," Kola clarified. "She works at Lawson Group." The driver thought for a moment. "I'm not sure, sir, but she looks like a junior staff. Entry level, maybe." Kola nodded, his jaw tightening. Entry level, that meant long hours, low pay, little security. Abuja was not a forgiving city for people at the bottom. Every naira had to be accounted for, every decision mattered, and yet she still gave. As they reached his estate, the gates sliding open smoothly, Kola felt an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. The guards saluted. The house staff welcomed him. Everything was in place as it always was. But for the first time in a long while, his home felt too quiet. Later that night, Kola stood by the wide window of his study, looking out over the manicured lawns. His phone buzzed with emails and messages, but he ignored them. Instead, his thoughts drifted backward, far beyond the city, far beyond his wealth. He remembered his younger self. There was a time when he too had struggled, when success was not guaranteed, when hunger had been a real fear. Back then, kindness had mattered, community had mattered, people had helped each other because survival depended on it. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that. The next morning, Kola arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building buzzed to life slowly. Cleaners moving quietly, security checking entrances, early staff settling in. From his glass-walled office, Kola had a clear view of the floor below. He watched as employees trickled in, greeting one another, sharing jokes, complaining about traffic. Then he saw her. Abeni walked in wearing the same calm expression he had seen the evening before. Her clothes were neat but simple. She moved with purpose, not trying to draw attention to herself. She greeted a colleague softly, then headed straight to her desk. Kola watched closely. She worked with focus, answering calls, patiently typing notes, resolving issues without fuss. When a customer raised their voice on the phone, she listened quietly, apologizing gently, offering solutions instead of excuses. She did not roll her eyes like others sometimes did. She did not complain when tasks piled up. During lunch break, she ate alone at her desk, a small meal packed from home. While others laughed loudly in groups, she scrolled through her phone, then returned to her screen. Something about her steadiness drew him in. By the end of the week, Kola found himself paying attention to details he had never noticed before. How she stayed late without being asked. How she helped colleagues troubleshoot problems even when it wasn't her responsibility. How she thanked the cleaners when she passed them. None of it was dramatic. None of it demanded praise, and yet it spoke volumes. The office, however, had begun to notice too. Whispers traveled faster than emails. People wondered why the CEO's gaze lingered on a junior staff member. Some were curious, others were suspicious. A few were quietly resentful. But Abeni noticed nothing. She continued her routine work market roadside home. Each day bled into the next. She did not see Kola watching her from a distance. She did not hear the questions being asked behind her back. All she knew was that she had responsibilities both visible and invisible. One afternoon, as Kola reviewed departmental reports, he paused at the customer service section. Names and performance metrics filled the page. When his eyes landed on Abeni's file, he stopped scrolling. Her numbers were solid. Not spectacular, but consistent. Few errors, high customer satisfaction, no complaints. She could do more, he murmured to himself. It was not a criticism, it was an observation. That thought followed him for days. The more he watched her, the more convinced he became that Abeni had untapped potential. She wasn't loud enough to be noticed. She didn't push herself forward. But beneath her quiet demeanor was discipline, empathy, and resilience. Qualities that couldn't be taught. One evening, as the office prepared to close, dark clouds gathered outside. Rain began to fall, first lightly, then heavily. Staff rushed out, eager to beat the storm. From his office, Kola noticed Abeni still at her desk, finishing up a call. He hesitated, then made a decision. Grabbing his jacket, he stepped out, scanning the floor for her. By the time he reached her desk, it was empty. She had already left. For a brief moment, he considered going home. Then he remembered. The roadside, the disabled men and women, the black nylon bag. Without overthinking it, Kola headed to the parking lot. Drive toward the junction, he told his driver. The rain had soaked the roads, making the city shine under streetlights. Traffic was lighter now, but the air was cold and damp. As they approached the familiar spot, Kola leaned forward, his heart beating faster than he expected. And there she was. Abeni stood under the rain, her clothes slightly damp, her hair pulled back tightly. She held the nylon bag close to her chest as she knelt, handing out food one last time before the rain worsened. Kola felt something twist inside him. He rolled down the window. "Abeni," he called gently. She froze, startled. Slowly she turned. For a second she didn't recognize him. Then her eyes widened. "Sir," she said, standing up quickly. "Good evening, sir." "You'll catch a cold standing out here," Kola said. "Do you need a ride home?" She hesitated. Pride and caution flickered across her face. Then she nodded. "Yes, sir." "Thank you." As she handed out the last pack of food and climbed into the car, Kola knew without doubt that his life was crossing paths with hers for a reason. He just didn't know yet how deeply that crossing would change them both. The ride home that evening passed in near silence. Rain drummed softly against the car windows as Abeni Okoye sat stiffly in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap. She kept her gaze fixed outside, watching the blurred lights of Abuja slip past. Sitting beside her was Kola Lawson, the CEO of Lawson Group, a man she had only ever seen from afar, usually flanked by executives or moving briskly through corridors. Now he was right there, close enough for her to notice the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "Thank you again, sir," she said quietly after a few minutes, her voice barely rising above the sound of the rain. Kola nodded. "You don't have to thank me. Anyone would do the same." Abeni did not reply. She knew that wasn't true. When the car stopped in front of her modest street, she stepped out quickly, grateful for the warmth she was leaving behind, but even more grateful for the end of the awkwardness. She bowed her head slightly in respect before turning toward her building. "Good night, sir," she said. Kola watched her walk away, her steps steady, unhurried, until she disappeared behind the iron gate. Only then did he tell the driver to leave. That night, Abeni lay awake longer than usual. Her mind replayed the encounter again and again. Why had the CEO noticed her? Why had he followed her? The questions unsettled her. She had lived most of her adult life unnoticed, moving through crowds without leaving a mark. Attention, especially from someone so powerful, felt unfamiliar and dangerous. By morning, she convinced herself it meant nothing. At Lawson Group, life returned to its usual rhythm. Phones rang endlessly, emails piled up, meetings came and went. Abeni slipped back into her routine, answering calls and resolving complaints with quiet efficiency. But something had changed, even if she didn't realize it yet. Kola Lawson was watching her more closely now. From his office, he noticed how she arrived early and left late, how she took on extra tasks without protest, how she spoke to customers with patience that bordered on compassion. Where others rushed, she stayed. Where others argued, she listened. He began calling her name during meetings, not to criticize, but to ask questions. "Abeni," he would say, his voice calm. "What's your view on this?" The first time it happened, the room went silent. Heads turned, eyes widened. Abeni froze, her heart pounding. She swallowed hard and answered carefully, choosing her words with precision. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, clarity followed. Her points were simple, practical, grounded in experience. Kola listened intently. When she finished, he nodded once. "Thank you." That was all. But it was enough to spark whispers. Why is the CEO asking her? Since when does he notice junior staff? What's special about her? Abeni heard none of it. Or rather, she heard it and chose to ignore it. Gossip had always existed. It had never helped her, and she refused to let it distract her now. What she did notice was the change in her workload. New responsibilities began to land on her desk. Tasks that usually went to more experienced staff. Reports that required careful analysis. Projects that demanded long hours and attention to detail. At first, fear gripped her. She worried about making mistakes, about failing publicly, about proving the whispers right that she didn't belong anywhere near the center of attention. But each time doubt threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered the faces at the roadside. She remembered why she worked so hard, why she endured so much. So she pushed herself. She stayed late teaching herself skills she had never needed before. She read manuals. She watched tutorials. She asked questions quietly, never boasting, never demanding recognition. Some colleagues noticed and resented it. Among them was Zainab Bello, a senior staff member who had been at Lawson Group for years. Zainab was confident, vocal, and ambitious. She believed she had earned her place through loyalty and experience. Seeing a quiet junior employee suddenly entrusted with important tasks stirred something bitter inside her. She watched Abeni closely, waiting for her to fail. But failure never came. Instead, Abeni delivered, every time. Her reports were thorough. Her solutions were practical. When challenges arose, she faced them head-on without excuses. Slowly, reluctantly, even some of the skeptics had to admit she was capable. Kola noticed that too. What impressed him most wasn't just her competence. It was her humility. Even as her responsibilities grew, her demeanor didn't change. She still greeted everyone with respect. She still ate quietly at her desk. She still left work every evening with that same black nylon bag in hand. One afternoon, Kola passed by the customer service floor during lunch. Through the glass, he saw Abeni sitting alone eating from a small container. He paused. He had lunch meetings almost every day, lavish meals, strategic conversations. Yet something about her simple meal eaten without complaint struck him deeply. He realized then that Abeni carried herself the same way everywhere, with dignity. That realization weighed on him. By the end of the month, it was clear to everyone that something unusual was happening. The CEO's interest in Abeni had become impossible to ignore. People spoke in hushed tones, speculating about favoritism, hidden motives, unspoken relationships. None of them knew the truth. They didn't know that Kola Lawson saw in Abeni a reflection of the values he had lost along the way. They didn't know that he was questioning his own legacy, wondering what all his wealth meant if it wasn't used to uplift people like her. One evening, as staff filtered out of the building, Kola called Abeni into his office. She stood nervously at the door, unsure what she had done wrong. "You wanted to see me, sir?" she asked. "Yes," he replied, gesturing for her to sit. "I've been reviewing your work." Her chest tightened. "You handle pressure well," he continued. "You don't complain, and you don't cut corners." Abeni lowered her eyes. "I just try to do my job well, sir." Kola studied her for a moment. "That's exactly why I'm giving you more to do." She looked up, startled. "Don't be afraid," he said calmly. "I wouldn't assign you tasks I didn't believe you could handle." Those words stayed with her long after she left his office. As she walked home that night, the city buzzing around her, Abeni felt something unfamiliar stir inside her. Not pride, not ambition, hope. She didn't know where this path would lead. She didn't know why the CEO had chosen to notice her, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, she would face it the same way she faced everything else, with quiet strength, unwavering integrity, and a heart that refused to harden no matter how loud the world became. The rain returned the following week, heavy, relentless, and unforgiving. By the time the office lights dimmed and most employees hurried out with umbrellas raised, Abeni Okoye was still seated at her desk, finishing the last of her tasks. Her eyes burned from hours of staring at the screen, but she refused to leave until everything was complete. Deadlines mattered, promises mattered. When she finally logged out, the building was nearly empty. She slipped her phone into her bag, pulled on her jacket, and stepped outside into the rain. The air was cold, sharp against her skin. She did not hesitate. She never did. At the small market near the junction, vendors packed up quickly, trying to protect their goods from the downpour. Abeni moved through them with familiarity, choosing bread and packaged meals carefully. Her money was already stretched thin that week, but she bought what she could. She always did. The black nylon bag grew heavy in her hand as she made her way toward the roadside. The disabled men and women were still there, huddled closer together, now seeking shelter under broken umbrellas and makeshift coverings. When they saw her, surprise crossed their faces. "You came even in the rain," one of them said softly. Abeni smiled, kneeling despite the wet ground. "Hunger doesn't stop because of rain." She handed out the food quickly this time, the cold seeping through her clothes. She was almost done when headlights slowed beside her. A car window rolled down. "Abeni," a familiar voice called. She froze. Slowly she turned. Kola Lawson sat in the back seat, his expression serious, his eyes fixed on her. For a moment neither of them spoke. Rain fell between them, heavy and unrelenting. "You'll get sick standing there," he said at last. "Please get in. I'll take you home." Abeni hesitated. Pride tugged at her. So did exhaustion. She handed out the final pack of food, wiped her hands on her skirt, and nodded. "Thank you, sir." Inside the car, warmth wrapped around her like a blanket. She sank into the seat without realizing how tired she truly was. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable this time, it was thoughtful. Kola watched her from the corner of his eye. She looked drained, her face pale, her shoulders slumped. Yet there was no complaint on her lips. "You do this every day?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir." "Why?" The question hung in the air. Abeni looked out the window, gathering her thoughts. "Because someone has to," she said finally. "And because I can, even if it's not much." Kola nodded slowly. After a moment he spoke again. "Do you live alone?" "Yes, sir." "My parents retired and moved back to the village. I stayed in the city to work." "That can't be easy." She smiled faintly. "It's life." The car turned into her neighborhood, a place far removed from the gleaming estates Kola was used to. The roads were narrow, the houses modest, the streetlights dim. Children played under the rain's edge, laughing despite the cold. "This is me," Abeni said, pointing as the car stopped in front of an old but sturdy building. She stepped out, rain splashing around her feet. "Thank you for the ride, sir. I really appreciate it." Kola watched her walk toward the gate, then disappear inside. He did not drive away immediately. For the first time in years, his chest felt heavy, not with stress, but with reflection. She had nothing, and yet she gave everything she could. That night, Kola did not sleep well. He lay awake, replaying the conversation, the rain, the quiet dignity with which Abeni carried her burdens. The image of her kneeling on wet ground, feeding strangers with money she could barely spare, refused to leave his mind. By morning, he had made a decision. He would test her, not to expose her weaknesses, but to reveal her strength. Over the next few weeks, the challenges increased. Abeni was assigned to oversee a small operational review work that required coordination across departments. It was a task usually reserved for senior staff. When the email landed in her inbox, her breath caught. She read it twice, then 3 times. "Was this a mistake?" whispers erupted almost immediately. "Why her? She's not qualified. This is too much." Abeni heard the doubts but chose not to engage. She asked for clarity where needed, studied past reports, and stayed late every night. The work was exhausting. There were moments she wanted to cry, moments she felt she was drowning. But she remembered the rain. She remembered the roadside, and she kept going. Kola observed from a distance. He saw her struggle, but he also saw her adapt. When she didn't know something, she learned. When she made mistakes, she corrected them. She did not shift blame. She did not cut corners. What impressed him most was that even now, with the pressure mounting, she still went to the market every evening. She still carried the black nylon bag. She still knelt beside the disabled. Her kindness had not diminished under pressure. It told him everything he needed to know. One afternoon, after reviewing her completed report, Kola leaned back in his chair, a rare smile touching his lips. "She's ready," he said to himself. But Abeni did not know that yet. All she knew was that life felt heavier and somehow more hopeful at the same time. She was being pushed beyond her comfort zone, forced to grow in ways she never imagined. And though fear walked beside her, it no longer led the way. As she left the office that evening, black nylon bag in hand, rain clouds gathering once more, Abeni had no idea that the road ahead would soon lift her far beyond the narrow streets she called home. Nor did she know that the man watching her from afar was preparing to change her life forever. The days that followed moved with a strange intensity, as if time itself had tightened its grip around Abeni Okoye's life. Every morning she woke before dawn, her body aching from long nights and longer thoughts. She prayed quietly, asking for strength, not success. Then she dressed, packed a modest lunch, and headed into the city. Abuja greeted her each day with the same mix of promise and pressure: honking cars, hurried footsteps, voices layered over one another like noise that never truly stopped. At Lawson Group, the atmosphere around her had shifted. Her desk no longer felt invisible. Colleagues passed by more often, some curious, some wary. A few offered help that sounded more like probing questions. Others watched silently, waiting for her to stumble. Abeni noticed it all but chose not to react. She had learned long ago that attention could be as dangerous as neglect. What unsettled her most was the growing weight of responsibility. The operational review she had been assigned expanded quickly. Meetings multiplied. Emails arrived late at night. Departments that barely acknowledged her existence now needed her input. Every decision felt heavier than the last. Some nights, as she sat alone in her small apartment, spreadsheets open on her laptop, doubt crept in. Why me? What if I fail? What if they were right? On those nights, she closed her laptop, knelt beside her bed, and reminded herself of something simple: she had not asked for this. But she would not run from it either. Across the city, Kola Lawson was having his own sleepless nights. From the outside, nothing about his life had changed. He still attended high-level meetings, approved budgets, and negotiated deals that could shape entire industries. His schedule remained packed, his phone constantly buzzing, yet internally a quiet reckoning was unfolding. He found himself thinking about Abeni at unexpected moments, during meetings, during dinners, even during conversations that demanded his full attention. He wondered how many people like her existed within his company, unseen and unheard, simply because they did not know how to demand recognition. He also wondered how many he had ignored. One evening, after reviewing Abeni's latest report, Kola closed the file and leaned back in his chair. The numbers were solid. The analysis was careful. The recommendations were thoughtful. There was no trace of recklessness or ego. "She works like someone who knows what it means to lose everything," he murmured. That night, instead of going straight home, Kola told his driver to take a different route. Toward the residential blocks, he said. The driver glanced back, surprised, but said nothing. As the car moved through less polished parts of the city, Kola looked out the window with a new awareness. He saw children selling sachet water, women balancing goods on their heads, men gathered around flickering lights. This was the Abuja most executives rarely saw, the one that worked endlessly without applause. When the car stopped near Abeni's building, Kola hesitated. He wasn't sure why he was there. Then he saw her. Abeni stepped out of a small grocery shop, the familiar black nylon bag in her hand. She walked toward the building, her pace steady, her expression tired but calm. Without thinking, Kola stepped out of the car. "Abeni," he called. She turned startled. "Sir." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," he replied quickly. I wanted to see how you were managing." The words sounded awkward even to his own ears. Abeni nodded politely. "I'm managing, sir. Thank you for asking." There was a pause, one filled with things neither of them said. "May I?" Kola asked, gesturing toward the building. She hesitated, then nodded. "It's not much." Inside the apartment was exactly as Kola had imagined, and yet seeing it in person struck him harder than expected. The space was clean but sparse. A small table, a narrow bed, books stacked carefully in one corner, no decorations, no luxury. This was the home of someone who had learned to live with only what was necessary. "You live simply," Kola said quietly. Abeni smiled faintly. "It makes life easier." He nodded, understanding more than she knew. As they stood there, the distance between CEO and employee seemed to shrink. They spoke briefly about work, about the city, about nothing in particular. Then Kola excused himself. Walking back to his car, something settled firmly in his chest. A decision. The next morning, Kola called a private meeting with the board. The discussion was long, careful, and confidential. Names were mentioned, risks were assessed, objections were raised. But Kola remained calm, unwavering. "She has earned this," he said firmly, "and she will earn even more." By the time the meeting ended, the path forward was clear. Meanwhile, Abeni continued her routine, unaware that her life stood on the edge of transformation. The pressure intensified, deadlines overlapped, expectations rose. There were moments when exhaustion blurred her vision and she questioned how much more she could carry. But each evening she still walked to the market. She still knelt by the roadside. She still listened to stories of pain far heavier than her own. Those moments grounded her. One night, as she handed out food, an elderly man took her hand gently. "God sees you," he said softly. "Even when people don't." The words stayed with her. A few days later, an email arrived in her inbox. Boardroom meeting. Mandatory attendance. Her heart skipped. She stared at the screen, reading the message over and over. There was no explanation, no agenda, just a time and location. Fear crept in. Had she made a mistake? Had something gone wrong with the review? Was she about to be reprimanded in front of everyone? All day her hands shook slightly as she worked. Colleagues noticed her distraction but said nothing. Even the whispers seemed to fade into the background. When the meeting time arrived, Abeni stood outside the boardroom door, her pulse racing. Through the glass, she could see the silhouettes of powerful figures, men and women whose decisions shaped the company's future. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room fell silent. Kola Lawson stood at the head of the table. Their eyes met. For a moment he saw fear flicker across her face, and something else too. Courage. And in that instant he knew without doubt that he was about to change not just her life, but the very meaning of leadership within his company. What neither of them realized was that this step, this quiet, carefully planned step, would set off a chain of events far greater than promotions or titles. It would test loyalty. It would expose envy. It would demand truth. And it would prove once and for all that the smallest acts of kindness often prepare us for the greatest responsibilities. The boardroom doors closed behind Abeni Okoye with a soft, final click. Inside, the air felt heavier than anywhere she had ever stood. The long table gleamed under white lights. Faces she recognized only from company newsletters and internal memos now studied her closely. Directors, senior executives, people whose signatures carried weight beyond numbers. At the head of the table stood Kola Lawson. "Abeni," he began, his voice steady, measured, "we've been reviewing your recent work." Her hands tightened around the folder she carried. She waited. "You've handled responsibilities beyond your role with discipline and clarity," he continued. "Effective immediately, you'll be overseeing a cross-department operational project. You'll report directly to me." A murmur rippled through the room. Abeni's breath caught. This was no small assignment. It was the kind of project that shaped careers or ended them. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. When the meeting ended, she walked out with her head held high, but inside fear roared. She knew what this meant. More eyes, higher expectations, less room for error. And the office felt it too. Within hours, whispers filled corridors and break rooms. "Did you hear? She's reporting directly to the CEO now. This is madness. She hasn't even been here that long." Some spoke in disbelief, others in envy. Zainab Bello watched from her desk, her jaw tight. Zainab had dedicated 6 years to Lawson Group. She had climbed slowly, carefully, believing loyalty would eventually be rewarded. Seeing Abeni, a woman who barely spoke, who kept to herself, suddenly entrusted with such power, felt like an insult. "It doesn't add up," Zainab muttered to a colleague. "People don't rise that fast without a reason." The implication hung in the air. Abeni felt the change immediately. Meetings grew tense. Emails arrived loaded with hidden tests. Some colleagues withheld information. Others smiled politely while hoping she would fail. The warmth she once found in anonymity vanished. Every step became heavier. At night, exhaustion wrapped around her like a weight. She returned to her small apartment later than ever, barely eating before opening her laptop again. Documents blurred. Numbers swam. Doubt crept in with cruel persistence. What if I'm not enough? What if they were right about me? But each morning she rose anyway. She organized meetings with calm authority. She asked questions without apology. When she didn't understand something, she admitted it and learned quickly. She listened carefully, documented everything, and made decisions rooted in fairness rather than ego. Kola watched closely. He noticed how she handled resistance without confrontation, how she responded to criticism without defensiveness, how she took responsibility when things went wrong and shared credit when things went right. What impressed him most was what she didn't do. She didn't boast, she didn't complain, she didn't change. And still, every evening she carried the black nylon bag, even when deadlines loomed, even when pressure threatened to crush her. She still walked to the market, still knelt by the roadside, still fed the disabled with quiet devotion. For Kola, that was the clearest sign of all. The project moved forward faster than expected. Departments that initially resisted began to cooperate. Processes improved, costs reduced, efficiency increased. Results spoke louder than rumors ever could. Still, the tension refused to fade. One afternoon, Abeni overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. "She's just pretending to be humble," a voice said. "No one gets this close to the CEO without something going on." The words cut deeper than she expected. That night she sat alone in her apartment, tears slipping down her cheeks for the first time in weeks. Not because of the work, but because of the judgment. She had never sought attention, never chased power, and yet it followed her relentlessly, now twisting her intentions into something ugly. For a moment she considered stepping back, resigning, returning to invisibility. Then she remembered the elderly man at the roadside, his trembling hands, his quiet prayer. She wiped her tears and opened her laptop again. Failure was not an option. Days turned into weeks. The project reached completion and the results were undeniable. During the final review meeting, board members nodded in approval. Some even smiled. One spoke up. "This is impressive," he said. "Who led this?" All eyes turned to Abeni. She felt her heart race but stood calmly. "I did," she replied, "with support from the team." Kola said nothing. He didn't need to. After the meeting, he called her into his office. "You did well," he said simply. Relief washed over her. "But this," he added, "is only the beginning." Her brows furrowed. "Sir, you're capable of more than you know," Kola continued. "And soon you'll need to be ready. Ready for what he didn't say." As Abeni left his office, confusion mingled with cautious hope. She sensed something was coming, something bigger than projects or titles. And somewhere deep within the walls of Lawson Group, resentment hardened into resolve. Zainab watched the door close behind Abeni, her expression unreadable. "This isn't over," she whispered to herself. What Abeni didn't know, what no one but Kola suspected, was that the path ahead would test her integrity more than any workload ever could. It would expose the truth behind every whisper. It would demand courage beyond competence. And it would prove whether quiet strength could survive a storm built on envy and lies. The morning of the presentation arrived with a silence that felt unnatural. Abeni Okoye woke before her alarm, her heart already racing. For a moment she lay still on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the city waking up. Today was different. She could feel it in her bones. She washed, dressed, and prayed longer than usual. When she arrived at Lawson Group, the building seemed to hold its breath. The corridors were quieter, footsteps more measured. Whispers followed her as she walked past, some curious, some sharp, some heavy with expectation. The boardroom had been prepared since early morning. A large screen dominated one wall. Bottled water lined the polished table. Leather chairs stood neatly arranged, each one carrying the weight of authority. This was where decisions were made, decisions that changed careers, lives, and sometimes entire industries. Abeni stood outside the glass door, clutching her notes. Her palms were damp. Her throat felt tight. "You belong here," she told herself. "You earned this." Inside, the board members gathered slowly. Men and women in tailored suits exchanged quiet greetings. Some glanced at Abeni with mild curiosity. Others barely looked at her at all. At the head of the table sat Kola Lawson. He did not smile. He did not frown. His face was unreadable, his posture relaxed but firm. Yet when Abeni's eyes met his, she saw something steady there, something grounding. "Begin when you're ready," he said. Abeni stepped forward. For a brief second, the room blurred. Then she took a breath and started. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'll be presenting the findings from the cross-department operational review." She clicked the remote. The first slide appeared. As she spoke, her nerves slowly loosened their grip. She moved through the data, methodically, cost inefficiencies, workflow bottlenecks, communication gaps. She explained not just what was wrong, but why it was happening. And more importantly, how it could be fixed. She spoke from experience, from long nights, from careful listening, from quiet observation. Charts followed, projections, solutions. She anticipated questions before they were asked. When one board member interrupted her, she paused respectfully and addressed his concern with clarity. Another challenged her assumptions. She acknowledged the risk and explained how she had mitigated it. The room changed. Skepticism gave way to attention, attention to interest. By the time she reached the final slide, the tension had shifted. The board members leaned forward now. Pens scratched against notepads. Heads nodded slowly. When she finished, silence filled the room. Abeni stood still, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they could hear it. Then one of the directors spoke. "This is thorough," he said. "Very thorough." Another added, "You've clearly done your homework." A third nodded. "I'm impressed." Abeni allowed herself a small breath of relief. But Kola Lawson remained silent. He studied her carefully, his expression unchanged. After a moment he stood. "Thank you, Abeni," he said. "You may step outside." Her heart skipped. She gathered her notes and walked out, unsure whether she had just succeeded or failed. Outside the boardroom, minutes stretched into something unbearable. She paced slowly, her thoughts spiraling. Had she spoken too softly? Had she missed something? Had she gone too far? Inside, the discussion continued without her. Some praised her insight. Others questioned whether she had the experience to handle greater responsibility. Risks were debated, precedents examined. Kola listened without interruption. When the conversation finally settled, he raised his hand. "She has what we can't teach," he said calmly. "Integrity, discipline, perspective." No one argued. The decision, though not yet revealed, had already been made. Later that afternoon, Abeni was called back into the room. This time the atmosphere was different, warmer, heavier with meaning. "You did well today," Kola said, meeting her gaze. "But understand, this today was not a reward. It was a test." Her stomach tightened. "And you passed," he added. Relief washed over her in a wave so strong she nearly swayed. "But don't get comfortable," he continued. "There is more work ahead, much more." Abeni nodded, unsure what to say. "I'll do my best, sir." "I know you will." As she left the boardroom, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. For the first time in her professional life, she had been truly seen, not as a junior staff member, not as an object of gossip, but as a capable leader. Word spread quickly. By the next day, the entire office buzzed with the story. She stood before the board and didn't shake. They said she answered every question. I heard the CEO himself praised her. Some spoke with admiration, others with disbelief, and a few with resentment. From her desk, Zainab Bello watched Abeni pass by, her jaw clenched. The whispers no longer satisfied her. Proof no longer mattered. Something darker had taken root. That evening, Abeni left the office later than usual. Her body ached, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in months. She stopped by the market, bought what little she could, and walked to the roadside. The disabled men and women greeted her warmly. "You look tired," one of them said. She smiled. "A little." As she handed out the food, a sense of calm settled over her. No boardroom, no whispers, just people and shared humanity. What she did not know was that this presentation had marked a turning point, not just in her career, but in the balance of power around her. For while some now saw her as a rising leader, others began to see her as a threat. And threats in the wrong hands invite storms. The weeks following the board presentation unfolded with a quiet intensity that few people truly understood. To most employees at Lawson Group, life went on as usual: emails, deadlines, meetings stacked upon meetings. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The company was no longer just watching Abeni Okoye. It was measuring her. And Kola Lawson was thinking far beyond the present. Late one evening, long after the office lights had dimmed, Kola sat alone in his study files spread across his desk. He wasn't looking at market forecasts or acquisition plans. He was reviewing Abeni's work history, every report, every feedback note, every small improvement she had made since joining the company. What he saw confirmed what his instincts had already told him. She had never asked for attention. She had never asked for promotion. She had never used proximity to power for advantage. Everything she had earned came through effort and restraint. Kola leaned back, exhaling slowly. This woman barely has enough for herself. He murmured, recalling the sight of her kneeling on wet pavement, yet she remembers everyone else. That thought stayed with him. In the days that followed, he began to move quietly. He scheduled private conversations with board members, never all at once, never publicly. Over coffee, during short breaks between meetings, he asked careful questions. What do you value more in leadership experience or character? What kind of person should run daily operations when the pressure is highest? Who do you trust when no one is watching? Some board members hesitated. Others answered confidently. But as the conversations accumulated, a pattern emerged. They all described Abeni without realizing it. She listens. She doesn't rush decisions. She carries responsibility without ego. Kola never argued. He only nodded. At the same time, he began testing her in subtler ways. He asked her to sit in on senior meetings, not to speak, but to observe. He assigned her temporary oversight of departments that had long resisted change. He gave her problems without clear solutions and watched how she navigated uncertainty. Abeni noticed the weight increasing even if she didn't fully understand why. Some evenings she returned home so tired her hands trembled as she unlocked her door. She cooked simple meals, ate in silence, and stared at the walls while her mind replayed the day's challenges. Still, she did not complain. Still, she showed up. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Abeni sat at the edge of her bed, her phone resting unused in her hand. She thought of calling her parents in the village, but stopped herself. She didn't want them to worry. She didn't want to explain pressures she barely understood herself. Instead, she prayed. "Give me strength," she whispered. "Not success. Just strength." The next morning, Kola called another board meeting, this one marked confidential. The discussion lasted hours. Risks were debated openly now. Some worried that moving Abeni too quickly would spark backlash. Others questioned whether the company was ready for such an unconventional decision. Kola listened patiently. When the room quieted, he spoke. "I'm not asking you to gamble," he said. "I'm asking you to recognize what's already in front of us." He paused, letting his words settle. "She has carried more responsibility in silence than many people with titles. If we truly value integrity and competence, then we must act accordingly." The room fell into thoughtful silence. No decision was announced that day, but the resistance weakened. Meanwhile, whispers within the company grew sharper. Some employees admired Abeni openly, now inspired by her composure and work ethic. Others grew restless. For them, her rise felt like an accusation, proof that years of comfort and complacency were no longer enough. And among those watching most closely was Zainab Bello. Zainab had noticed the shift in how people spoke about Abeni. The admiration, the quiet respect. The way senior managers now sought her input. It felt unbearable. "She's not special," Zainab told herself again and again. "She's just lucky." But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Late one evening, Zainab sat alone in a cafe near her apartment, stirring a cup of untouched tea. Her thoughts spiraled darkly. If she keeps rising, she thought, there'll be no room left for people like me. An idea began to form, not fully, not clearly, but it lingered. Back at the office, Abeni continued working, unaware of the storm quietly assembling behind her. One afternoon, Kola called her into his office. She entered cautiously, her heart thudding. "Sit," he said gently. She obeyed. "I've been watching how you handle pressure," he began, "not just professionally, but personally." Abeni lowered her eyes. "I just do what needs to be done, sir." "That's exactly it," he replied. "You do what needs to be done even when no one is watching." He leaned forward slightly. "There may come a time when your responsibilities increase significantly," he continued. "When they do, it will not be because of favoritism. It will be because you've proven yourself." Her breath caught. "I don't need to know what you do outside this office," Kola added quietly. "But I know this: you have a sense of duty that goes beyond this company." Abeni felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. As she left his office, her mind raced. What responsibilities? What is he preparing me for? She didn't know the answers yet, but she sensed something monumental approaching, something that would change the shape of her life. That evening, as she walked toward the roadside with her black nylon bag, the sky burned orange with sunset. She knelt beside the familiar faces, handing out food, listening to stories. One of the men looked up at her and smiled. "You carry a heavy load," he said. "But your heart is light." She smiled back, unaware of how true those words were. Behind her, unseen and unheard forces were aligning, some to lift her higher than she had ever dreamed, others to pull her down in ways she could not yet imagine. And as fate tightened its quiet grip, one thing became clear: Abeni Okoye was no longer just a junior employee who fed the forgotten. She was standing at the threshold of power. And power, once approached, never comes without a price. The boardroom was filled earlier than usual that Friday morning. There was no official agenda circulated, no hints, no whispers leaked in advance, yet everyone could feel it. Something important was about to happen. The air carried a tight expectancy, the kind that made even seasoned executives straighten their backs and lower their voices. Abeni Okoye stood outside the glass doors, her palms damp, her thoughts racing. The email had been brief. Boardroom, 9 a.m. Attendance required. No explanation. No preparation. She had barely slept the night before. As she stepped inside, every conversation stopped. Heads turned. Eyes followed her to the seat closest to the door. Instinctively, she chose not to sit near the center. Old habits of humility were hard to break. At the head of the table stood Kola Lawson. He waited until the last board member arrived before speaking. "Thank you all for coming," he began calmly. "This meeting will be brief, but its outcome will shape the future of this company." Abeni felt her heart pound. Kola continued, his voice steady but firm. "Over the past months, we have assessed our operational structure and leadership readiness. We have also observed individual performance under pressure." His eyes moved slowly around the room, then stopped on Abeni. "Abeni Okoye," he said. She looked up, startled. "Yes, sir, please stand." Her legs felt weak as she rose. "For months," Kola continued, "you have carried responsibilities far beyond your role. You have done so without complaint, without entitlement, and without seeking recognition." The room was silent. "You have demonstrated discipline, clarity, and integrity," he said. "Qualities this company needs, not in theory, but in practice." Abeni's breath caught. Effective immediately, Kola announced, "The board has approved your appointment as Chief Operating Officer of Lawson Group." For a moment, the words did not register. COO. Second only to the CEO. Abeni's vision blurred. Murmurs erupted around the table, some shocked, some impressed, some stunned into silence. Kola raised a hand, restoring calm. "As COO," he continued, "you will oversee daily operations, implement strategic directives, and ensure efficiency across all departments. This is not an honor. It is a responsibility." Abeni's hands trembled. Her voice broke. She swallowed hard. "Thank you, sir." But Kola was not finished. In recognition of the demands of this role, he added, "The company will also provide official housing and a company vehicle effective immediately." That was when the tears came. Abeni tried to stop them. She failed. She covered her mouth, overwhelmed not by ambition fulfilled, but by disbelief. Just months ago, she had been invisible. Just weeks ago, she had been fighting whispers and doubt. And now here she was, standing on ground she had never imagined touching. "I don't know if I deserve this," she said softly. Kola looked at her steadily. "You deserve the chance," he replied. "What you do with it is up to you." The meeting ended shortly after, but the shockwaves did not. By noon, the entire building buzzed. "She's the new COO, from junior staff to COO. This company has lost its mind." Some congratulated her warmly. Others smiled through clenched teeth. A few avoided her entirely. Abeni moved through it all as if in a dream. Her new office, spacious, bright, overlooking the city, felt unreal. The keys to the company car felt heavy in her hand. The offer letter lay open on her desk, words blurring as she read them again and again. That evening, instead of going to the market, Abeni sat alone in her office long after everyone had left. The city glowed beneath her window. Her phone buzzed, mother calling. Her hands shook as she answered. "Hello, Mama," Abeni, her mother cried, voice trembling with excitement. "Your father is here. Put me on speaker." We heard what Abeni asked weakly. "That you've been promoted," her father's voice joined in. "They said you're now one of the leaders of the company." Abeni laughed softly through tears. "Yes, Papa. It's true." There was silence, then sobs of joy. "We prayed for you," her mother said. "But we never imagined this." Abeni closed her eyes, letting their voices ground her. That night she went home, not to her small apartment, but to the temporary company residence arranged for her. The house was quiet, elegant, and foreign. She walked through it, slowly touching the walls as if to confirm they were real. She sat on the edge of the bed and wept, not for the house, not for the car, but for the journey. The next morning she returned to work early. As COO, her schedule doubled overnight. Meetings stacked back to back. Decisions demanded clarity and speed. Every word she spoke carried weight. But something remarkable happened. Abeni did not change. She still listened more than she spoke. She still treated cleaners and security with respect. She still carried the memory of the roadside with her into every decision. Within weeks, her impact was undeniable. Processes streamlined. Communication improved. Departments that once resisted now cooperated. Results followed. Kola watched from a distance, quietly satisfied. "She's using power the way it should be used," he said to himself. Yet not everyone shared that sentiment. From her desk, Zainab Bello watched the transformation with burning resentment. The title, the office, the authority. Everything she believed should have been hers now belonged to someone else. And in that moment, Zainab made a silent decision of her own. If Abeni could rise so quickly, then she could fall just as fast. As the sun set over Abuja and the city lights flickered on, Abeni sat in her new office, unaware that her greatest test had not been the climb. It was what came after. 5 months passed. To the outside world, Abeni Okoye's life looked like a miracle neatly wrapped in success. The modest junior employee who once sat at the back of the office now walked the halls as Chief Operating Officer of Lawson Group. Her days were filled with high-level meetings, strategic decisions, and responsibilities that reached far beyond anything she had ever imagined. She lived in a beautiful house now, quiet, secure, surrounded by trimmed hedges and guards at the gate. A sleek official car waited for her every morning. Her name appeared in business headlines, spoken with curiosity and admiration. Yet inside, Abeni remained unchanged. Each morning before the driver arrived, she stood by the window and prayed. Not for more success, not for protection from enemies, but for wisdom. "Let me not forget who I was," she whispered. "And let me not lose who I am." At the office, people treated her differently now. Some bowed a little too deeply. Some smiled too widely. Others spoke carefully, measuring every word. Power had created distance, but Abeni refused to let it create walls. She still greeted the cleaners by name. She still thanked the security guards. She still listened when junior staff spoke, even when meetings were long and tempers short, and every evening when the city lights began to glow. Abeni slipped into another world, one she shared with no one. What most people didn't know was that shortly after her promotion, she had quietly begun working on something deeply personal. It started with a single rented space on the outskirts of the city. No signboard, no press release, no announcement. Just a small building with peeling paint and open doors. Abeni called it the Rise Above Disability Empowerment Center. At first, it was nothing more than a dream shaped by memory. She remembered the faces at the roadside, the men and women who had accepted food from her hands with gratitude and dignity. She remembered how often society reduced them to objects of pity, never partners in possibility. I don't want to feed them forever, she told herself. I want them to stand. So she began quietly. She hired skilled instructors, tailors, carpenters, artists, computer trainers, people willing to teach patiently and respectfully. She designed programs that focused not on limitations but on strengths. Sewing for those with steady hands, woodwork for those with creativity, digital skills for those with sharp minds. The center became a place of learning. People arrived unsure, hesitant, carrying years of rejection on their shoulders. Abeni welcomed them not as beneficiaries but as partners. She listened to their dreams. She asked what they wanted to learn, what they loved, what they feared. Slowly, confidence returned. A man who had begged by the roadside learned carpentry and began making stools. A young woman who had lost her legs to illness learned graphic design and started taking small online jobs. Another discovered a talent for painting that brought both income and pride. Abeni paid the instructors quietly. She provided materials, she covered transportation for those who needed it, and she told no one, not the media, not her colleagues, not even Kola Lawson. To her, this was not a project to showcase. It was a calling to protect. At Lawson Group, Kola noticed changes in her subtle ones. She worked harder than ever, yet seemed more tired. Sometimes she arrived early with shadows under her eyes. Other times she stayed late long after meetings ended, staring thoughtfully at reports as if her mind were elsewhere. One afternoon he called her into his office. "You're doing exceptional work," he said. "But you seem stretched." Abeni smiled politely. "I'm fine, sir. Just adjusting." Kola studied her, unconvinced. "If you need support, I know," she interrupted gently, "and I appreciate it." He nodded, though questions lingered. What Kola didn't know was that every time Abeni left the comfort of her official car, she felt more like herself. Every time she stepped into the modest center, greeted by hopeful faces and honest effort, the weight of corporate power lifted. This, she believed, was why she had been lifted. Meanwhile, within the walls of Lawson Group, reactions to Abeni's leadership were mixed. Some admired her deeply. They saw her fairness, her discipline, her refusal to abuse authority. They felt safer bringing ideas to her, knowing she listened without judgment. Others, however, simmered with resentment. Among them, Zainab Bello watched closely. From her perspective, Abeni's rise was not just unexpected, it was unbearable. Every success Abeni achieved felt like a personal loss. Every praise sounded like an insult to years of loyalty Zainab believed she had invested. She began paying attention to Abeni's movements. Why did the COO leave so late? Why did she sometimes arrive looking exhausted? Why did she decline invitations to public events that could boost her image? Zainab noticed things others ignored. She noticed that Abeni never spoke about her life outside work. She noticed how carefully she guarded her privacy. And slowly, a dangerous curiosity turned into suspicion. No one is that clean, Zainab told herself. Everyone has something. One evening after work, Zainab sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through her phone. Her frustration boiled over into resolve. "I'll find it," she whispered, "whatever she's hiding." The next day, Abeni stood at the center watching a group of trainees practice new skills. Laughter filled the room, a sound she rarely heard in boardrooms. An elderly man approached her quietly. "Madam," he said, his voice steady, "because of this place I no longer beg." Abeni felt her throat tighten. "That's all I ever wanted," she replied softly. As she drove home that night, she felt content in a way wealth had never provided. She did not know she was being watched. She did not know that envy had sharpened into intent. She did not know that the very secrecy she believed protected her work would soon be twisted into a weapon against her. Because while Abeni had built the center with pure intentions, others were preparing to rewrite the story. And when that story surfaced, it would not speak of empowerment. It would speak of theft, of lies, of betrayal. The calm before the storm settled quietly over her life, and far away from the roadside where it all began. A new battle was already forming, one that would test not her competence but her character. As Abeni Okoye settled deeper into her role as Chief Operating Officer, the rhythm of her days grew more demanding and more visible. Meetings stretched longer. Decisions became heavier. Every signature she placed on a document carried consequences that rippled through the company. And yet amid the pressure, something else began to surface, something quieter, more personal, and far more complicated. Kola Lawson noticed it first. He had always respected Abeni's work ethic. He had admired her integrity from a distance. But now, as they worked more closely, that admiration began to change shape. He found himself arriving at the office earlier than usual, hoping to catch her before the day swallowed them both. He lingered after meetings, asking questions that went beyond spreadsheets and forecasts. Sometimes he simply sat across from her in silence, studying the calm focus in her eyes. It unsettled him. This was not how he operated. Feelings were distractions, attachments were risks. His life had been built on discipline, not emotion. Yet every time he saw Abeni defend a junior staff member in a meeting or refuse to cut corners even when shortcuts promised quick gains, something stirred in him. "She reminds me of who I used to be," he admitted to himself one evening, "and who I should have remained." Abeni, for her part, sensed the shift but did not name it. She noticed the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her, the way he checked on her well-being without making it obvious, the concern that flickered across his face when she looked exhausted. But she pushed the thoughts aside. Power complicated everything, and she had learned the hard way that misunderstandings at this level could destroy reputations overnight. So she remained careful, respectful, professional. Unfortunately, others were watching and interpreting everything through darker lenses. The office whispers returned sharper than before. "Have you noticed how often the CEO visits her office? He never did that with the previous COO. This whole thing is starting to look suspicious." Some spoke with curiosity, others with envy, a few with outright malice. Abeni felt it in the way conversations stopped when she walked past, in the forced smiles that greeted her, in the silence that followed her decisions even when they were fair. She had expected resistance. What she hadn't expected was how lonely leadership could feel. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting, Abeni retreated to her office and closed the door. She rested her forehead against the cool glass of the window, breathing slowly. "I didn't ask for this," she thought. "Why does it feel like I'm being punished for it?" Meanwhile, Zainab Bello watched everything with growing intensity. From her desk, she saw the way Kola's gaze softened when he spoke to Abeni. She saw the deference others showed her now. She heard the praise whispered in hallways. To Zainab, it felt like a theft. "That should have been me," she told herself. "I earned it." The resentment she had carried for months hardened into obsession. She began to study Abeni's patterns. Her arrival times, her departures, the days she stayed late, the evenings she declined social invitations. Something didn't add up. "She doesn't network," Zainab muttered one evening. "She doesn't show off. And yet she keeps rising." The thought gnawed at her. Driven by equal parts jealousy and desperation, Zainab made a decision. She would find what Abeni was hiding. A few discreet calls later, a private investigator agreed to help. "I just need the truth," Zainab said over the phone, her voice calm but tight. "Whatever it is." The investigator began quietly following Abeni after work. For days he reported nothing unusual. Abeni left the office late, drove through the city and returned home. Occasionally, she stopped briefly at unremarkable locations. Then one evening, he followed her farther, to a modest building on the outskirts of the city. He watched as disabled men and women entered the building. He saw instructors arrive with materials. He saw Abeni move among them not as a superior, but as a guide, a listener. The report he delivered to Zainab was not what she expected. "She's running an empowerment center for people with disabilities," the investigator said, "training them, supporting them. There's nothing illegal." Zainab's grip tightened around her phone. "No," she snapped. "That can't be all." "It is," he replied. "If anything, she's doing remarkable work." Zainab hung up, anger blazing in her chest. Too clean, too perfect. For a moment, doubt flickered. What if she really is that good, but jealousy is louder than reason? If she won't fall on her own? Zainab whispered, pacing her apartment, "Then I'll push her." She thought quickly. A secret charity, no public records, no transparency, that's it. The very discretion Abeni had chosen out of humility could now be weaponized. Within days, carefully planted rumors began to circulate. Where do you think the money came from? Why would a COO hide something like that? Maybe she's diverting company funds. The word spread like poison, slow at first, then faster, fueled by curiosity and fear. Abeni sensed the shift immediately. Meetings grew colder. Emails became formal. Questions carried an edge. One afternoon, she overheard a hushed conversation outside her office. Stealing company money. Secret charity. CEO doesn't even know. Her heart stopped. She stepped into the hallway. The voices fell silent. "What did you say?" she asked calmly. No one answered. That night, she sat alone in her living room, the weight of dread pressing down on her chest. She replayed every decision she had made, every payment, every receipt she had carefully kept. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she knew how easily truth could be twisted. Across the city, Kola Lawson stared at his office window, unaware that the ground beneath Abeni was already shifting. He felt the change in the company's atmosphere. The tension, the unease. "What's going on?" he asked a senior manager. "Nothing concrete," the man replied carefully. "Just talk." Kola frowned. Talk had destroyed more careers than mistakes ever had. And somewhere in the shadows, Zainab Bello watched the ripples spread, her heart pounding not with guilt but with anticipation. The trap had been set. All it needed now was a spark. The spark came sooner than Zainab Bello had expected. For days after the rumors began circulating, the atmosphere at Lawson Group grew tense and brittle. Conversations lowered to whispers. Emails were written twice, then rewritten, as if everyone feared their words could be used against them. Trust, once thin, began to crack. Zainab watched it all with careful satisfaction. She had not accused Abeni directly. She hadn't needed to. All she had done was ask the right questions in the right ears. Does the CEO know about the center? Who approved the funding? Why keep something so big a secret in a corporate world obsessed with compliance and transparency? Secrecy itself became the crime. The private investigator called again, uneasy. "There's nothing illegal," he repeated. "I checked thoroughly. The funds are personal, clean." Zainab's voice hardened. "Then you didn't dig deep enough." "There's nothing more to dig," he replied. "She's not hiding money. She's hiding herself." Zainab ended the call without a word. She didn't need proof anymore. She needed a narrative. A few anonymous emails were sent from accounts that couldn't be traced easily to select journalists known for chasing controversy. The wording was careful, suggestive rather than direct. Top executive accused of secretly diverting company funds. Hidden charity raises questions about corporate ethics. Is favoritism blinding Lawson Group's leadership? The story was irresistible. A powerful company. A billionaire CEO. a fast-rising female executive with a secret. Journalists began asking questions. At first, Lawson Group's communications team dismissed the inquiries as speculation. But the calls didn't stop. By the third day, social media had picked up the whispers, dressing them in bold headlines and half-formed opinions. Abeni felt the shift before she saw it. Meetings she normally attended were postponed. Files she requested arrived late. People avoided eye contact. Even her assistant spoke more carefully, as if every word carried risk. One afternoon, she was called into a meeting with the legal and compliance teams. Her chest tightened as she entered the room. "We've received inquiries regarding an external organization linked to you," one lawyer said cautiously. "We need clarification." Abeni nodded, her voice steady. "I'll provide whatever documentation you need." She explained the center, how it started, how it was funded, why she kept it private. She presented receipts, bank statements, and contracts. Everything was transparent. The lawyers exchanged glances. "There's no evidence of wrongdoing," one of them admitted. "But the optics are complicated." Optics. The word echoed painfully. That evening, as Abeni drove toward the company gate, cameras appeared. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. Then the microphones came out. Abeni Okoye, a reporter, called. "Is it true you've been stealing company funds to run a secret charity?" Her heart lurched. What she whispered. More voices followed. "Did the CEO approve this? Why hide it if it's clean? Are you using your position for personal gain?" Cars slowed. Phones came out. Employees gathered near the gate, watching in stunned silence. Abeni froze. She had faced boardrooms without shaking, but this was different. This wasn't analysis or logic. This was accusation. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice barely audible. "I only wanted to help." The reporters pressed closer. "Then why keep it secret? Are you afraid of an investigation? Did Lawson Group fund your charity?" Her chest tightened. The words tangled in her throat. From an upper floor, Kola Lawson stood at his office window, watching the chaos unfold below. "What's happening?" he demanded. A staff member hesitated. "Sir, the press is accusing the COO of misappropriating funds." Kola's jaw tightened. He didn't believe it. Not for a second, but belief wasn't enough. Down below, Abeni stepped out of the car, her legs shaking. Tears blurred her vision as she faced the crowd. "Please," she said softly. "I didn't do anything wrong." No one stepped forward to defend her. Not the colleagues she had supported. Not the managers she had protected. Not the company she had served with loyalty. The silence cut deeper than the accusations. That night the story broke. Headlines screamed speculation. Comment sections overflowed with judgment. Her name, once respected, was dragged through doubt and suspicion. Abeni sat alone in her living room, the television muted images flashing across the screen. She felt numb. How had helping others turned into this? Her phone rang repeatedly. She didn't answer. Across the city, Kola Lawson sat in his office long after everyone had left. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. He knew the truth, but he also knew the rules. By morning, he called an emergency board meeting. The atmosphere was grim. "We must act," a board member said. "Public trust is at stake." "I believe she's innocent," Kola replied firmly. "But belief isn't enough. We need process." Silence followed. Then Kola spoke the words that tore at his own heart. "Abeni Okoye is to be placed on indefinite suspension, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." The decision was unanimous, but it didn't feel like victory. When Abeni received the letter, her hands trembled. Suspension, investigation. She had expected questions. She had not expected abandonment. She walked out of the boardroom without a word, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. Cameras waited outside, but this time she didn't stop. She went home. For days she stayed inside, replaying everything in her mind, the center, the people she had helped. The secrecy she thought protected them. Had she been naive, Kola called her twice during that time. She didn't answer. He needed more than words now. He needed the truth to be seen, not argued. One evening, without informing anyone, Kola drove to the outskirts of the city. He followed the address he had quietly memorized from internal documents. When he arrived, he saw it, the modest building, the open doors, the people learning laughing building. He stood in the shadows watching Abeni teach, not as a CEO, not as a COO, but as a servant to humanity. Tears filled his eyes. This was no crime. This was courage. And as he turned away, one thing became clear: he would not allow lies to destroy what kindness had built. Not now. Not ever. The battle for Abeni's name had just begun. The weeks that followed Abeni Okoye's suspension moved painfully slow. Each morning she woke to silence instead of schedules. No meetings, no urgent emails, no driver waiting outside. The world that had once demanded every ounce of her strength had suddenly gone quiet, and the quiet was unbearable. Her phone stayed face down on the table. She could not bring herself to answer it. News channels replayed the footage from the company gate. Commentators dissected her expression, her words, her tears. Social media argued endlessly, some defending her, many condemning her. She looks guilty. If she had nothing to hide, why keep secrets? Power always corrupts. Each comment felt like a stone added to her chest. For the first time in years, Abeni did not visit the market. She did not go to the roadside. She did not step into the empowerment center. Not because she didn't care, but because she was afraid. Afraid that her presence would draw attention. Afraid that the people she loved helping would be dragged into the storm. She stayed indoors, curtains drawn, moving through the house like a ghost. At Lawson Group, Kola Lawson felt the weight of his decision every hour. The suspension had been necessary. At least that's what procedure demanded. The investigation had to be thorough, transparent, undeniable. Any hint of favoritism would only deepen suspicion and destroy Abeni completely. Still, it felt like betrayal. He replayed her words again and again. I didn't steal anything. I only wanted to help. He believed her, but belief alone could not silence the world. Kola followed the investigation closely. Independent auditors combed through financial records. Legal teams traced transactions. Compliance officers reviewed emails, approvals, and access logs. Every trail led to the same conclusion. Nothing. No missing funds, no unauthorized transfers, no misuse of company resources. And yet the damage was done. Abeni, meanwhile, retreated further into herself. One afternoon, she finally answered her phone. It was her mother. My child. Her mother said gently, why are you not answering us? Abeni's voice broke. Mama, I'm tired. There was a pause. Then her father spoke, his voice steady. Listen to me. We did not raise you to be afraid of the truth. If your hands are clean, then lift your head. Tears spilled freely now. I did everything right, Abeni whispered. And still they turned on me. They didn't turn on you, her father replied. They turned on what they don't understand. Those words stayed with her long after the call ended. Across the city, Zainab Bello watched the fallout with grim satisfaction. The whispers had become headlines. The headlines had become judgment. And Abeni, once untouchable, was now isolated. But satisfaction quickly turned to fear. The investigation dragged on. And the longer it lasted, the clearer the truth became. Zainab noticed subtle changes. Lawyers stopped asking Abeni questions. Auditors began requesting information from other departments. Emails arrived asking about anonymous tips and their sources. The ground beneath her feet began to shift. One evening, Zainab received a call she hadn't expected. We need to talk, the investigator said. This isn't going where you think. Her stomach twisted. What do you mean? There's no crime, he replied bluntly. And they're tracing the leaks. Zainab hung up, her heart pounding. For the first time, doubt crept in. Had she gone too far? Meanwhile, Kola Lawson made a decision of his own. He would no longer rely on reports and summaries. He needed to understand the full truth, not as a CEO, but as a man. Without informing his office, he drove back to the Empowerment Center. This time he did not hide. He stepped inside. The room fell quiet as people noticed him. Tools rested in hands. Conversations paused. Abeni stood at the far end, frozen in shock. "Kola," she said softly. "I'm here to see," he replied. "Not as your boss, as a witness." She nodded, stepping aside. He watched closely as instructors guided students through lessons. He listened as participants spoke about their progress, their income, their dignity restored. One man approached him, standing tall despite his crutches. "Before this place," he said, "I begged every day. Now I work, I earn, I live." Kola felt his throat tighten. He turned to Abeni. "Why didn't you tell me?" She lowered her eyes. "Because I didn't want permission to do what felt right." The honesty cut deep. When Kola left the center, his path was clear. The next morning, he called a press conference. The room filled quickly, cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. Kola stood at the podium, calm but resolute. "The investigation into Abeni Okoye is complete," he announced. "There is no evidence of wrongdoing. None." Murmurs rippled through the room. "The allegations were false," he continued, "and those responsible will be held accountable." Questions flew. Why was she suspended? Who leaked the story? Will she return? Kola answered carefully. The suspension was procedural. It allowed an unbiased investigation. Now that the truth is clear, Abeni Okoye will be fully reinstated with immediate effect. Across the city, Abeni watched the broadcast in disbelief. Her hands trembled as tears streamed down her face. The truth had survived. Later that evening, Kola invited her to a quiet restaurant overlooking the city. When she arrived, he stood to greet her not as a superior, but as an equal. "I'm sorry," he said simply. She nodded, emotions overwhelming her. "I needed to see the truth myself," he continued. "And I did." He slid an envelope across the table. Inside was her reinstatement letter. And another document, a formal company pledge to fund the Empowerment Center monthly, openly, transparently, and without conditions. Abeni covered her mouth, sobbing. "You believed in me," she whispered. "I believe in what you stand for," Kola replied. As they sat there, the city lights shimmering around them, both understood something profound. Justice had not come easily. Truth had not arrived quietly. But it had come. And what remained now was not anger or fear, but a future rebuilt on trust. The night air was calm as Abeni Okoye sat across from Kola Lawson. The city lights of Abuja shimmering through the restaurant's wide glass windows. The tears she had cried moments earlier were still warm on her cheeks, but something inside her had changed. The weight was gone. For weeks she had carried shame that did not belong to her, fear born from lies, doubt planted by envy. And now, for the first time since the scandal began, she could breathe. Kola watched her quietly. "I should have protected you better," he said at last, even when the process demanded distance. Abeni shook her head gently. "You did what you had to do. If you hadn't followed the truth all the way, no one would believe it now." Her strength humbled him. He reached into his jacket and brought out a small velvet box. Abeni's breath caught. "I didn't promote you only because you were capable." Kola said, his voice steady but deeply sincere. "I did it because you reminded me what leadership is meant to be. Service, integrity, courage." He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring. "Abeni Okoye," he continued, "you changed my life long before I changed yours." Will you marry me? For a moment the world stood still. This was not part of any plan, not a board decision, not a strategic move. It was simply truth. Abeni's eyes filled again, but this time with joy. She nodded, unable to speak, then whispered, "Yes." The embrace that followed was quiet, full of gratitude rather than spectacle. As they sat back down, Abeni's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, confused, then answered. "Hello, this is the office of the National Commission for Persons with Disabilities," a calm voice said. "The president has followed your story closely and would like to meet you in person." Her hands trembled. The next morning, escorted by security, Abeni arrived at the presidential villa. Cameras lined the entrance. Officials waited. Kola stood beside her, pride unmistakable in his eyes. Inside, the president greeted her warmly. "I have read about your work," he said. "Not the scandal, the impact. You did what many with power refuse to do." He placed a national honor around her neck, the room erupting in applause. But he was not finished. "In recognition of your dedication," he continued, "I am nominating you for the position of Minister of Humanitarian Affairs and Poverty Alleviation, subject to confirmation." Abeni stood frozen. From roadside kindness to national service, the journey felt unreal. As applause filled the hall, she understood something deeper. Her life had never been about promotion, never about wealth, never even about recognition. It had always been about people. Later that evening, Abeni called her parents. Her mother wept openly. Her father's voice shook with pride. "We raised you with little," he said, "but you carried that little with dignity." Now the world sees it. In the days that followed, the truth emerged fully. Zainab Bello was exposed as the source of the leaks. Evidence traced the anonymous emails back to her. She was dismissed from Lawson Group and faced legal consequences for defamation and misconduct. Abeni did not celebrate. She simply forgave. When asked why, she answered quietly, anger would only steal time from the work ahead. As she prepared for her new role, standing at the edge of a future larger than herself, Abeni returned one last time to the Empowerment Center, not as a secret benefactor, but as its founder. The people she once fed now stood taller, working with confidence. "This is only the beginning," she told them. "We rise together." And so the woman who once knelt on wet pavement with a black nylon bag now stood before a nation, not as a symbol of scandal, but as proof that no act of kindness is ever wasted. When compassion meets courage, destiny listens. This story reminds us of a truth the world often forgets. Real greatness is not loud, and real kindness does not wait to be seen. Abeni's journey was never about titles, wealth, or recognition. It was about choosing to care when it was inconvenient, choosing integrity when silence was easier, and choosing compassion even when the cost was high. She gave when she had little, stood firm when lies tried to break her, and forgave even when she had every reason not to. Life does not always reward goodness immediately. Sometimes doing the right thing attracts misunderstanding, envy, and even betrayal. But this story shows that truth has a way of surviving storms. When your intentions are pure and your actions are rooted in service, time becomes your ally. Justice may be delayed, but it is never blind. And no act of kindness, no matter how small or hidden, is ever wasted. Abeni's life changed not because she chased success, but because she stayed faithful to who she was when no one was watching. Her story is a reminder that your character is your greatest inheritance. Positions can be taken away, reputations can be attacked, but a clean heart and a clear conscience will always find their way back to the light. If this story touched you, take a moment to share what it meant to you in the comments. What lesson stood out the most? And if you believe in stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of the power of kindness and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and stay connected for more stories like this.